So it's fantastic to be here. Tom, thank you for that introduction. And I want to thank Tom, I want to thank Kim, I want to thank Anna Karos for building this amazing VR lab that you have here. At Stanford, we actually don't have a place where faculty can come and have their dreams visualized by a bunch of great coders. We don't have places where students are working there all day long on VR, so you have something really special here. Congratulations on building it. I want to thank Nick for supporting this conference. A really special thing, really great to be here with you. So my name's Jeremy. My PhD was in cognitive psychology in the late 90s. I was studying how the brain works, studying how decisions were made, getting into some neuroscience. I drastically switched fields in 1999. I went to the University of Santa Barbara, and I learned how to build the hardware to make VR. I learned how to code the software. And at the same time, I moved away from questions about how the brain works, and I started asking larger processes, things like social interaction, education, training, and communication. So today I've prepared a talk that's really about a snapshot of what we're doing in the lab now. I'm going to talk about a lot of research from our students. Given the theme of this conference, you're going to hear a lot about what the students do. I have you for about 40 minutes. We're going to talk about VR's landscape today. I'm going to spend 10 minutes on the downsides of VR. It's kind of a bummer, but we have to be honest that there's some problems with this medium, and we really need to embrace that and lean into it. I know we're optimistic at this conference, and the talks have been amazing and inspiring, but we have to slow down a little bit. We're then going to talk about a very special data set that can help you and help us better understand humans and VR. I'm then going to focus on some studies that transform time and space, and we're going to close by talking about scale, projects that began in the lab that are now a very large-scaled use in the millions of people. So there's about 30 million headsets, more or less, in the United States, my best guess. How many people have a VR headset? How many people used it this week? Yeah, that's about right. About 1 in 10 of you have used your VR headset this week, and that tends to be the right ratio. There's a lot of headsets, not a lot of headsets getting used. But what I'm going to focus today is not the consumer use of VR, but a project on what is the research telling us, what do we know about people that use VR? So what I do is I put people in a headset, I run an experiment on them, and then I check to see how that VR experience changed their behavior, their attitudes, their cognition. How many studies do you think are like that? And you don't need to guess right now, but it's a question that no one's really answered before. The problem is that you can't search keywords. If you search for keywords, I just threw 7 of them up here today, and you'll note that I chose these 7 carefully. There's not one single overlapping word. So much jargon in VR. It's just, you drown in jargon, right? So there's so many keywords. But then, if you try to search all the keywords, you're now swimming in false alarm. So if I search for AR, I get a lot of research on rifles, right? If I search for MR, I get Mr. Bailenson, right? So you can't just search for these keywords. There's also the function of misses. So this is the Proteus effect. This is work by Nick Yee. This is my most cited paper ever. If you search any of the terms I had up on the previous slide, you're going to miss this paper. And in fact, if you search my publications by the search term virtual reality, you miss about 60% of them. So you can't search for these via keywords. So I'm really excited to talk about a paper that I was hoping was going to be out by today. It's not out, but it should be coming out next week. This is the genius of Dave Markowitz, who is a former student of mine, who's now a professor at Michigan State University. And this is a database that is free for you to download, so I included the URL there. It's a database of many abstracts about VR. So we used large language models, and we started with a database of every paper that had ever been published by humans. We then honed it down to about 1 million papers that studied VR or AR. And what we did is we would have a model, LLM, parse every one and basically figure out if it was really VR or they were using VR in a gratuitous way, the term, and then find out if they were running an experiment. Every time that we would make progress, we'd have to do human codings to get rid of false alarms, to get rid of misses. I learned in this journey it's really expensive to do this. Right? I spent a lot of money on tokens. So we gave ourselves a budget of N, and we ended up going 4N on our budget. Super expensive. However, if you were to have humans code by hand, look at an abstract and then decide whether it was a VR AR study. I know this because I probably spent about 30 hours doing this myself. I was our coder. It takes 7 years. So a project that would have taken 7 years, we got done very quickly. And what we know now is there's about 21,000 studies that have examined experimentally what happens when a human puts on a headset. 21,500, amazing. This all begins in 1992 when the first issue of Presence came out, and you had people like Frank Bioca and Carrie Heater and Matthew Lombard publishing, the first social scientists that come to the field. 1999 is a very special year for me because that's when I came in to VR, and I would always tell my students that this is Jack Loomis's lab. You can see that the person is wearing a goniometer on their head there. That's how we did VR in 1999. It was pretty intense. And every single VR paper that was ever done as a social science project, I actually had in that file cabinet. Half of that file cabinet could store every single paper. I used to know all the details of them. You can't do that now. There's 22,000 of them. In 2015, there was a big inflection point in our field. Google Cardboard comes out, the Oculus Rift, the HTC Vive, and the Samsung Gear. Consumers start getting them. And then what you see is that when you look past that inflection point, then the academics really start chasing it. We have a slow field. It takes about 2 years. But I just want to blow your minds a little bit, and this is really to inspire some of the students here. Half of all research done in VR, half of it has happened since 2019. So we are really in new times, and it's a really special time to be thinking about this. So please join us in studying this. So what do we know? What do we know about this? We're going to focus a lot today on some new things that we're learning in the lab. But as I said, I want to start talking about the downsides. It's really important. So the number one downside that we think about a lot is distraction. VR is the most distracting medium ever invented. It replaces what your eyes see. It replaces what your ears hear. People, if you hashtag search VR fail, you'll find lots of videos of people doing unsavory things. As far as we know, there's only been one death in VR. A man in Russia fell through a plate glass table and bled to death, but we think a lot about distraction. Getting very serious for a moment, I'm on a quest to make it so no one ever kills another person while wearing a VR headset driving a car. You may say, no one would ever drive a car while wearing a headset, and I've written an article for TechCrunch. If you search up the other DUI, you'll find it. We have data on this. It's a video game called Pokemon Go. Many people have been killed. Many people have been killed from people driving while playing Pokemon Go. There's hard data on this. This is not an opinion, this is a fact. And so if you ever meet anyone, our colleagues at Meta, our colleagues at HTC, our colleagues at Google, I don't care about passengers, I don't care about driverless cars, we should not make headsets function in cars. One person getting run over by somebody wearing a headset is too much. I don't care about your economic models for passengers and driverless cars. So I can't be clear about that. Simulator sickness. We put a lot of people in VR, probably put maybe 30, 40,000 people in VR over my career, and we know how to make simulator sickness less, but we can't get rid of it. So about 1 in 25 people, doesn't matter what I do, they're going to feel uncomfortable. And so, even with really light, fluffy glasses and great content and guidelines on duration, it's still a medium that leaves us a little bit affected. Reality blurring. So this is a paper published by Catherine Segovia. She brought kids in the lab, and they did something fantastic. They swam with whales. They came back a week later, and 50% of the kids had formed false memories, meaning they believed they'd actually been to SeaWorld and swum with whales. It's a very compelling experiment, and when you have young minds, these become blurry. Jackie Bailey, who's now a professor at the University of Oregon, Jackie studies how kids get influenced by VR. She'll do things like you meet Grover in VR, or you meet Grover on a TV, and when you meet Grover in VR, you're much more likely to do what Grover asks you to. You comply, and she's got a lot of data on that. We're thinking a lot about reality blurring with the new pass-through video and optical see-through AR glasses. So this is the cocktail party, right? And you've got some people there in headsets. You have some people not in headsets, and I made some red and some blue because you're seeing different things. So let's pretend the person in the blue beamed in their friend, and the person in the red beamed in an elephant, right? What we've lost is what Herb Clark from Stanford calls common ground. So right now in this room, we've got common ground. We all see the same thing. There's one version of this world. Maybe somebody's red-green colorblind and I don't see stereo as well as you, but for the most part, the functional parts of this room are the same for all of us. But that's not going to stay the same. So this is a study by Mark Miller. He was a former student. He's now a professor at the Illinois Institute of Technology. Mark had people wear the HoloLens, and they had an avatar sitting in a chair, just like you see here. And what Mark did is he asked people to walk up and to choose one of those two chairs. So everybody sat on the chair not with the avatar. Most people, when the avatar got up and walked away, still sat in the other chair. Like, so you don't want to sit in that chair. It's probably warm from that guy, right? You sit in the other chair, and that behavior persists in AR. One of the more interesting things that Mark discovered is that when you walk up to sit next to that guy, there's two ways you can rotate your body. You can rotate your body so you stick your behind towards him or your front towards him. And it's impolite to put your behind towards somebody. And so most of our subjects rotate their bodies in a certain way to do polite norms. But now let's go back to this cocktail party. And so the question is, we know that nobody wants to sit on a virtual human, but when you're forced to heinously violate another person's personal space or walk through a hologram, what are you going to do? And so what we're studying now is what happens with human behavior when there's no longer common ground, where there's not two versions of the world. So this is part of Oogie Han's dissertation work. She's got two students working on a grid. They're each wearing Quest 3 in this case, and the world is different. They each see very different arrays of those. And the question is, how does conversation function, and how does trust form when people are lost common ground? And Oogie's got some fairly powerful results. I won't give you specific numbers because it's not published yet, but some fairly powerful results showing that the connection between these two people goes way down, both in terms of their body language and in terms of their attitudes towards each other, when they realize slowly over time that the world's not the same for the two of them. Chris Mattson just mentioned the amazing ability to take Meshi, which is a sentence, into a 3D model and put it into Engage. And so we did that, and Meshi produces these beautiful photorealistic 3D models that are low polygon. And so I just gave a big tour of the lab. We had lots of people come through, and I gave them the perceptual Turing test. So they put on, everybody's wearing Quest 3s. We networked them together, and one of these balls is real, one of them is fake. And we had them, two people at a time, say, all right, we're going to play a cool game of catch where we're going to see, we're talking about distance underestimation of headsets. Everybody pick up a ball, and you're going to throw it to each other. And no one had any idea that one of these balls was fake. It was one of these just kind of jaw-dropping moments where we talk about the Turing test, is an AI real? What we now are seeing is that VR can be so real and AR can be so real that people don't know what's what. And it's a very, we're starting to study this phenomenon. I'm working with a student named James Gardner Brown, who is a military intelligence officer, and we're talking about how to think about misinformation in VR. We've built, for an experimental protocol, it's a fake moon landing conspiracy theory. So you're on the moon, and it's just full of awe, like, wow, I'm on the moon. And then you hear something behind you, a little spatialized sound. You turn around, and you realize there's the film set. There's the crew that's filming this fake moon landing, and you have a very compelling experience of a conspiracy. And so the same way it's hard to unsee an image, what we're studying is, can you unexperience a conspiracy theory? And important as, if we see what happens with social media continue to happen as VR becomes more immersive, we have to get ahead of this. So I'm of the opinion that a lot of room for smart people to disagree with my colleagues at Meta, my colleagues at Apple. I don't think we should be putting on headsets for computing. I know there's a norm within the tech companies that these headsets are going to replace computers, but everything I know about this medium, and I've been living in it for almost 30 years now, is it's not an everyday thing. It's not even it's not even a once-a-week thing sometimes. A little bit of VR goes a long way. So the case that I make is that we should use VR, but not in the same way that we think about other media. Okay, shifting out of the downside, so we're done with that, but we have to be careful, and for students looking for things to study, no one studies the downsides of VR. Everybody gets so inspired that they study the great stuff, so please do study it. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about probably the most stunning, jaw-dropping experience of my professional career, which is when we decided during COVID to not use Zoom, but to teach in VR. And so I'm summarizing 4 years of work here. 700 students is a major percentage of Stanford's undergrads, so you're looking at 10 to 15% of all Stanford students taking this class. And we'd put them in headset in various ways across these classes, and we'd put them in there for months. We get a lot of headsets. We got a huge assist from Engage, so thank you for helping us do this work. We would not be able to do it without Engage, so really appreciative of all the help that you've gave there. And we spent a ton of time with the IRB and with lawyers. We spent a year on this, a year, lots and lots of meetings, because what we achieved, the class themselves are data, anonymized data, but they're data. And so we had to come up with a whole protocol for consent and for how to do pedagogy with this, but we are legally allowed to take the entirety of the class and use that as data sets. Here's an example of a group of 6 people. And for those 6 people are for 40 minutes, we are having them do stuff in VR. They're talking, they're building stuff, they're doing all the things that others have talked about. And that's what one group from one session looks like. What we love about VR is we get the nonverbal data. 90 times a second, we're tracking the X, Y, and Z and the pitch, yaw, and roll of your head and your hands, okay? That's 18 data points and then mouth open, closed. That's 19 nonverbal data points that we get 90 times a second. In addition to getting all that nonverbal data, we're able to know who's speaking when. And so this is work by Cyan DeVoe, who has coded the way conversations function. And this is simply, in a group of 6 people, the amount of speaking time. So we've all been in groups where one person hogs the whole thing. That's your bottom right brown box there. And then we've been in ones where they're much better facilitated. And so what we're doing now is we can automatically detect when there is a asymmetric conversational structure going, and now you can intervene to make it better. The language data. So Cyan DeVoe also led this study. So with all the data that we have for every session, we are using partially AI to go from speech to text, but that's imperfect. So we have human coders who have to make sure that the utterances are perfect. And also what AI can't do is match the utterance to a specific speaker. So a lot of brave undergraduates have spent a lot of time coding these data. In addition, we have all the actions. And so if you're building something in VR, we know every move you made. And so this is work from Portia Wong, who's a Ph.D. student in our lab, as a computer scientist and a designer, and she's studying the process of building. And I want to focus on the bottom right, which is deleting stuff. And so if you look at someone's final design, what you don't see is the process, right? And so she's actually looking a lot of when you try something and then you get rid of it and fail. And so she's built a computational model of all of the movements and actions one takes when they're doing this stuff. So I want to go back. So for every person in this group of 6, we get their nonverbal behavior, we get the utterances, we get the speech acts, and we get what they're doing. And this is one of my discussion sections. And now this is a class, okay, where one discussion section is that one little box that you see. We've got 8 weeks and we've got 24 groups, and we've now taught 7 classes, okay? So I don't say this lightly. This is the largest data set in the history of human nonverbal behavior. In other words, we know how people are moving their bodies, we know what they're saying, and we also know how well they're doing in that day's class, how well they did on a quiz. So when you think about machine learning, you've got input data, which is what the stuff that's going on, the raw data, but you need a label, and we have both in this. It's a really stunning data set. And I want to take a step back. When my first year of grad school, I read a book by Alan Newell called Unified Theories of Cognition. Blew my mind as a student. One of those amazing moments as a student where you kind of have your jaw drop. And Newell talks about 4 bands of time in the brain. Okay, you've got the biological band, which is a couple of milliseconds. It's when a neuron fires. Okay, you've got the cognitive band, is when you make a decision. That's a few seconds. You've got the rational band, which is task performance. We're going to build this thing together in VR. It's about half an hour. And then you've got the social band, which is months. In all one of my 7 classes, students come, they don't know each other. They proceed to do this class in VR together, and we have them for 2 months. We can look at the millisecond level because they're tracking at 90 hertz. And so what we can do with this data set is we can fundamentally ask the question, how do humans form groups? how do humans form groups? What happens verbally? What happens non-verbally? And how can you facilitate better groups? So I'm going to move on from this topic. This data set is not yet public because we've got to be really careful about it. We have actually shared it with colleagues. There's a process for working with colleagues, so you can't download it, but if you're interested, certainly drop me a note. I'm now going to shift to talking about transformations of time and space, an obvious thing one can do with VR. And I'm going to talk about impossibly huge spaces. So has anyone ever had a 3-person meeting in a stadium? Yeah, I see one of you. I've had the luxury of having a few of them because I do a lot of work with Madison Square Garden, and we're going to talk about the Sphere later on today. There's something about a huge indoor space that just inspires awe, right? That's why we have cathedrals. So we got this beautiful high-ceiling room. There's a fair amount of research on this, but psychologically, we like to see rigorous studies. There's not so much because it's really hard to build huge rooms, and it's hard to study them. And so Ugi Han, who's a PhD student who's on the job market this year, if anybody's looking to hire a brilliant VR person as a professor, she wanted to study the ability of being in huge rooms. And so what we did for one of our courses is we built 192 rooms. We implemented something called stimulus sampling. For those that are going to do studies in VR, it's really important. For example, if you're going to study video games and you're comparing Tetris to Grand Theft Auto, and you're going to make a claim about the type of video game, that doesn't really work. You're comparing two games, not the types of games. You got to study lots of them, so you're not sure it's not anything specific about a single game. And so 192 different rooms that varied in how big they were. They could be constrained, or they could be panoramic. She also did an experimental task where every room, she would take a room and she would just raise the ceiling. That's, it's 3 lines of code. If you're in VR, it's really hard to raise the ceiling in the real room, but pretty easy to do that. And what she found is, of the findings in my lab, we always talk about robustness and replicability. This is one of the more robust ones, really big effect sizes, which is people feel good. They feel restored. They are more productive simply by raising the ceiling. And in VR, that's free. I mean, it's literally a line of code. And so it's one of the easiest thing you can do with your meetings in VR. Don't stick somebody in a tiny, tight room like this. But we often, in every study we do, we look at behavior. And we just had a talk about sync, and I'm going to talk about synchrony. Synchrony is kind of the magic of nonverbal behavior. So in this room right now, you are synced with me. I love it. You're here. When I walk, your heads are turning towards me. We are a synchronous group. Synchrony is literally just the correlation of our body movements, right? And when I run experiments, we never want to trust what you say. We want to watch what you do, because self-report is really easy to fake. And so what this graph shows is the correlation among the group's body movements. And at that 0 point, that's where you're correlating in real time. And then as a control condition, you shift the numbers, the time arrays. So synchrony should go away when you move it. And what you see here is that bump at 0. You're getting better synchrony in large spaces than you are in small ones. Think about that. By just raising the ceiling up in this room, I have the essence of communication improve the way we're moving our bodies together. And that's a really nice variable. I'm going to talk about work now from Anna Quiroz. Where's Anna? Hey, Anna. Anna Quiroz leading many incredible projects. So she's a new professor here if you haven't taken a class with her yet. And she's did a bunch of incredible work in my lab. But this one I want to talk about, we're talking about place now and transformations in place. And she's run about 13,000 students in Brazil. And when I say she's run these subjects, you've got a team of people that are taking boats to places that are inaccessible, driving all over the place with headsets, really reaching a sample of students that don't tend to get VR. One of the findings she talks about a lot is self-efficacy. So for a girl or a boy that may not have considered themselves able to be a scientist, once they put on the headset and they do the process, the active agency of VR, they gain self-efficacy. But I want to talk about place. And so when you look at this map of Brazil, there are a lot of people who don't live near the water, and because of socioeconomic status, a lot of those kids can never get to the water. And so what they're experiencing in this headset, part of some of the content is they are putting on the Quest 2s, is that right? Quest 2s, and experiencing Coral Compass, which is a 4-minute 360 video that we made in my lab about climate change and coral bleaching and things of that nature, overfishing. What she then showed is that the blue line is people who used VR headsets. The gray one is people that did traditional learning. And what you can see here, as you move along the x-axis, that's how far away in terms of kilometers you are from the coast. And if you live on the coast, you care about the ocean. And what Anna's data is showing is that when you visit this place, the ocean, and you don't get to go there in your normal life, that this virtual travel causes you to care about the ocean in similar ways to one who lives there. And so it's a really nice data set. Now, the Coral Compass, as the one who built it, I can tell you we probably spent 3,000 hours on it. We flew to Palau. We had to go on boats. We had to rent 360 cameras that worked underwater and just over and over getting this footage, then stitching it together, and then, of course, building the narrative and everything. It took forever. And so one of the challenges in VR today is there's just not a lot of content. And so Monique Santoso, pictured in this image here, had the brilliant innovation, which is most of the things that we build around climate change and VR, they tend to be doom and gloom stories where you build something and it's incredible, and then something bad happens and you see the future, and then something uplifting happens because we want to give you hope. Monique said, let's forget the narrative here. What we're going to do is we're going to put people in specific places. Okay, so in this study, Monique had them put on the headset, and how many people have done Google Earth in VR? Okay, for those that haven't, that's homework. It's super fun. It's the thing that sounds the most boring, but you make yourself Godzilla-side and you kind of stomp through your own neighborhood. It's really inspires awe. And so what Monique decided to do is put people in places, and then while you're in a place, you're flying around and you're kind of going through buildings, and it's really just an incredible experience. You then settle somewhere in that city, and you hear a narrator reading a news story about climate change. So in other words, you take a real news story, and while I'm in the place, I get to hear it. And so we worked very hard to get a demographic of people from all over the country. And for everybody's zip code, we put them in one of 9 cities where they got to experience a place that's far away from where they lived. And then they heard a news story about how flooding is happening in Miami, and it's damaging all sorts of things when climate change terms are, how these extreme storms are causing people to lose their jobs, et cetera. So they hear the story while in the place. And what Monique's data, again, this is not published yet. We're going to submit this paper tomorrow or probably next week. When everybody cares about your home place, right? So without any VR manipulation, if you live in Miami, you care about climate change in Miami, and if you live in New Orleans, the same thing. When you experience this place in VR, you now care about the faraway place the same way that you cared about your home place. In other words, VR turns the faraway thing that you didn't care about before VR, and the control condition here is reading a story, looking at images, but you care about them more now. And Monique looked at 5 or 6 really brilliant variables. Like my favorite one that she studied is afterwards she had people write a letter to a lawmaker about climate change in that city, and then she used standard ways of analyzing writing strength and writing quality to see how well they wrote and how much they wrote when they were talking about climate change. When you experience a faraway place in VR, that goes up a lot. So a really nice way just thinking about VR as a place. This is a study by Portia Wong. Portia took, if you think about all those groups' data sets, what we have something really magic here. We've got the nonverbal behavior of groups. Now, I'm making all of my course materials free to the world. So they've got my books, PDFs are up for free, and they've got all of my syllabi and all of the course materials that I use, all of the places in VR that we visit, those are able for anyone to download. But what I can't replicate is the discussion section, right? The magic happens when people are talking, right? So what Portia did is she took these recordings of discussion sections. So one of the reasons we love Engage is the platform allows us to record all this data. You can record all the data with sufficient resolution that you can play it back and it feels like you're there. So we call this social time travel, which is that you get to visit a past conversation. And what you're seeing over here is if I were to join a conversation non-verbally, I would be on the outside looking in. So there's other people that are doing natural language processing to do the word side of this. What we're doing is the nonverbal accommodation. So what you see on the other side there, on the right side, is we've now positioned people so that there's an opening you can stand in. And we've now oriented their bodies the same way you would in a 5-person conversation. But the magic really is combing through, the millions and millions of data points about how people look at one another how they point at each other, using that training data to build basically the norms for how one will interact with you nonverbally when you join. And just to give you a sense, you go from being on the outside to looking inside, and Portia's data that she's published show that when you do this compared to just kind of experiencing a conversation as a ghost, all of the measures that she looks at, most of them show really good effects. So you look at people more, you feel more included in the group. It's just a really nice thing to be able to go back in time and then participate in a conversation. So I'm going to close now with 3 examples of scaled use. So at Stanford, we do lots and lots of experiments, but professors were also encouraged to go out in the world, and it's okay to work with companies, and it's okay to do things. So I'm going to talk about first Derek Belch's master's thesis. So Derek was a football player on the Stanford team. He went out and he got his master's, his MBA, and then he came back and he worked in my lab. His thesis was he convinced Coach David Shaw, who is a brilliant forward-thinking individual, he convinced Coach to give us 5 minutes of practice time on Monday. Okay, so we'd get 5 minutes of practice time. We'd put a 360 camera on the field, and we would take the quarterback, and we'd have the quarterback leave. The camera would film the quarterback's perspective. Okay, then we'd go back to the lab, and we'd stitch all this stuff together. We'd get it back to the football office Thursday and Friday, and the quarterbacks would practice. They'd put on the headset, and they would practice. When I say they'd practice, they're not kicking, throwing, they do that on the field. We're teaching them how to make decisions. And so when you are a quarterback, there's basically 2 decisions you can make. You've got a line of 3 or 4 plays, your cue, and you can kill, which means you go to the next one, or you can let it roll and just continue with that first one, or you can ask a running back to move to pick up a blocker. Those are the 2 decisions you have to make, and that all happens very quickly. So you just have that little flash of time to look at those defenders and decide if you're going to keep the play. That's all the time you have. And so Derek, we implemented this program for the Stanford football team. The quarterback, Kevin Hogan, as well as Coach David Shaw, both said one of the reasons why Stanford outperformed expectations that year was because of this training scenario. Derek graduates and he forms a company called Striver. I'm a co-founder of Striver, for full disclosure, and then just kind of shocks everybody by not just selling to lots of football teams, but really broadening out to just about every sport there is. For example, we work with the U.S. Olympic team. Skiers get 3 days on the mountain from each country. And so we convinced the U.S. Olympic team to allow us to film in VR the run so that our Olympiads could now go back and kind of practice and feel like they're on the field. That's a nice example. In the NBA, there's a lot of centers that tend to be bad free throw shooters. And we do work with them where they shoot free throws until they're perfect. And then we film them in 360 until they get 10 in a row with the right form. Then before games, they just kind of put on the headset, and they, instead of visualizing themselves, because visualization is hard, especially when you're in a slump, you visualize failure, they just experience themselves being perfect and actually help some people shoot better free throws. We work with the German national soccer team the year they won the World Cup on spacing for corner kicks, spacing for goalies, where to position, watch this penalty kick over and over and over again to read the body language of the person to predict left, right, or straight. But the moment that's fairly magic in VR's history when it's written will be, we were working with the Arkansas Razorbacks, and a guy named Brock wanders into the football office, and everybody loves sports, and Brock puts on the headset, and he says, what you're doing here, training people to recognize a complicated pattern, make a decision based on what they see and heard, and then tell others about that decision, is what our Walmart associates do every day. And so what starts is a long journey where Walmart's got 4,700 stores. We installed 3 or 4 VR systems in every single one. Okay, so if you work at Walmart, once every 2 weeks you go in the back room, you put on the headset, and you train. What do you train for? One of the scariest things I've ever done in VR is Holiday Rush, the day after Thanksgiving, where it's an utter cacophony, people all around you yelling and screaming, but because of turnover, only 1 in 2 employees have been there. But I'm going to talk about something a lot less pleasant. In the last year or so, a lot of Strivers companies have been, this is our best-selling module right now. Yeah, it's, you gotta laugh. So if you are training, if you're a teacher, if you work in a Walmart, if you work in a Verizon store, you get trained to do with an active shooter, but you do it from PowerPoint. And it doesn't really work that well. At my school last week, we had an emergency, and my daughters had to get under desks because of a shooting situation. Everything's fine. But some of the teachers were great, and some of the teachers were not. Right, because we're not giving them good training on this. And so when you put on the active shooter training, I mean, this guy comes up to you, screams at you, puts a gun in your face. It's one of the most intense things that I've ever done in VR. And so this 20-minute goes along, and we do lots of different training points. Obviously, your job is to keep people safe. You take that headset off, and the first thing you say is, that was really not a fun 20 minutes. The second thing you say is, I cannot believe the people before me just trained for that with PowerPoint, right? Because we're teaching you like where to stand your body to avoid lines of sight. One of the things that we do is, and this was for Verizon, not Walmart. Verizon has a principle: when a gunman comes in, you're not supposed to look him in the eye. And so what we do, we tell everybody that. Then in VR, halfway through, we said, hey, by the way, did you look that guy in the eye? Everybody says, no. Then we play back their heat map of their gaze and said, you actually looked at him for 40% of the time. Do it again. Do it again. We want you to fail in training and repeat. So this horrible day in El Paso, when a gunman killed so many people in that Walmart, a number of associates working on the floor that day had trained in VR, and the CEO of Walmart has said publicly that lives were saved because of the quick decision-making from people who felt like they'd been here before. So it's it's not a pleasant thing to talk about, but of all the use cases, this just feels one that, I hate we have to do it, but if we're going to do it, it shouldn't be PowerPoint, it should be VR. We're also now in every single Bank of America in the country. If you go in the back of a B of A, there's a couple VR headsets right now, and we train people to do lots of things. Of course, we also train them for active shooter, and I'm going to read this quote. A bank robber approached my teller window and demanded all my money. The subject looked aggressive, and I couldn't believe what was happening. I was nervous and froze, but then remembered everything I had seen in our VR robbery training and followed it step by step. You might say it's hard to remember a list of instructions in a moment like that, but I had already lived that moment in VR, and I just had to repeat it in real life. My teammates had taken the VR training as well and knew exactly how to react. And this is why we have VR. It's spatial, it's procedural, it's a really special thing. Again, it's not something that we're excited to talk about, but important. All right, Aditya's here. Pleasanter topics. Aditya was a graduate student working in my lab, and I had the pleasure of co-advising Aditya with Roy P., the educational technology genius, and I put up a screenshot of what, anybody know the name of the show? Magic School Bus, all right, for educational scholars doing tech, please read it. And Aditya's dissertation, really he spent a lot of time going into classrooms, finding out what the roadblocks were, seeing what teachers needed, and how you could fit VR into this curriculum. Aditya actually, unlike Derek, who formed a startup when he graduated, Aditya formed a startup while he was still in graduate school, which was very special. I will say that one of my principles is something called DICE, which is you don't use VR for everything. You have other media for that. You save VR for things that are dangerous, impossible, counterproductive, or prohibitively expensive in the real world. And I would say Aditya and I are very aligned. For full disclosure, I work with Aditya in this company as well. So just know that I want to disclose that. But we're very aligned on DICE. So we had a fun argument last night for those that were here. We had one gentleman, speaker, who said that you should never put a VR headset in classwork, only MR. And then we had a couple other people say that you should have people in headsets all the time in VR. Where I stand on it is using DICE for field trips. So I believe when VR can be used in the classrooms, it's barely at all, but when you use it, it's transformative. And I've got two examples here from Inspirit. So the reason I like talking about Inspirit is because when we talk about scale, there are now 4,000 teachers that are putting headsets on kids and running lots of these modules. When you think about the amount of students a teacher touches, that's a really important milestone in VR's history. So the one image you see, clean room, and with the CHIPS Act, we now have to train high school kids on how to use a clean room, but guess what? Kids aren't allowed in clean rooms. It's illegal. You have to be 18 or older to go in. So that's a beautiful use case for DICE. And this is, the other image is Gamble, Alaska, where there's 7 school districts and spirits in every single one. And they've got a module where they have to go out and measure trees. And they've got to understand how trees work in relation to one another. But they're on an island, and the island has no trees. There's not a single tree on the island. It's just the nature of this sea island, and they have, they're socioeconomically, they can't fly to other islands. And so for this, they need VR for this field trip. And so these are great examples of using VR barely at all, but when you use it, it's an epic win, right? There's no trees on the island. I can't get in the clean room. Now I'm going to shift and close with, how are we doing on time? Tom? Good, yep. Got about 3 more minutes left, that's good. Yep. We're going to talk about social touch. And this has always been a topic I've been very, I've always loved haptic devices and researching it. And so what you're seeing here is a system from the year 2005. It is a force feedback joystick that can record movements and then play them back later on. And so early in 2005, we ran a study. We had 2 people come in, and we recorded each of their handshakes. And then they met each other by handshaking the haptic device. One of the 2 people received their own handshake back, believing it was the other person's. In other words, one person shook the other person's hand, and then the second person shook his own hand. Okay? And so what the prediction here and what the outcomes were empathy, right? When I believe your handshake is mine, I like you more. We like things that are kind of similar to us. And as you can see, that's just an XZ plot of all the movements of handshakes. There's a lot of variance in people's handshakes. So if you're that dot, you like the other person when they get the dot back. And so this is early work that showed empathy. This is a paper just published really recently by a student named Yujia Tao. And Yujia, if you go to like social VR, VR chat, Engage, any of these places, a lot of times you just kind of lurk. You're watching people. And so the subject in this experiment had 4 points of haptic touch. They had the controllers that vibrate, and then they had these armbands by B Haptics around their arms. And then they watched 2 people. And every time they would haptically embody one of the 2 people. What that means is if one of the people, they got touched on the arm, they would feel the haptics there. If that person touched the person on the arm, they would feel it in their fingers. In other words, they haptically embodied people. And what you just showed is strong data showing that later on, if you've got a chance to stand by one of those 2 people or to give something to those people, or how you feel about them is strongly affected by whether or not you embodied their touch. And so again, another way that you can build empathy and just, what's a connection between people is touch. Now, to take a step back, sight and sound has always scaled up. Right now, there's 200 people in this room. You can all see me, and you can all hear me, but you can't all touch me. Touch doesn't scale. And so what I'm going to talk about now is the first time in human history that touch has scaled. So this is the Sphere in Las Vegas. How many have been to the Sphere? Okay, go to the Sphere. This is a screenshot for something called Postcard from Earth. Postcard from Earth is an hour-long immersive experience that's loosely about climate change. The screen at the Sphere is 4 acres. It's 16K resolution, which a lot of you probably haven't seen. There's huge fans in the front that bring wind. The wind can go about 30 miles an hour. It brings scent, heat, moisture, and cool. Your chairs vibrate. And we have 167,000 speakers that can spatialize sound. So Jim Dolan, the owner of Madison Square Garden, he built this because he believed that he didn't want VR as an isolating experience. And in 2016, Jim Dolan came to our lab. We talked about this as kind of a vision. And about 3.5 years ago, I started working for Madison Square Garden, helping them, helping this stuff work in ways that are good for the brain and good for the body. And what I'm going to talk about is my favorite moment, perhaps in VR history. You don't have to like the Grateful Dead to appreciate this moment. The Grateful Dead do something in their second set. It's called Drums in Space. Now, other bands, of the 18,500 seats, 10,000 of them have haptic feedback. The back of your chair vibrates, your butt vibrates. It's pretty neat. So some bands have done things like, well, they'll just have the seats vibrate with the amplitude of the sound, and you're getting constant kind of in your back. The Dead chose not to do that. They did not fire the haptic seats until the second set. In the second set, they do Drums in Space. It's this long drum solo. And so all these people are sitting down. And then the drummer, Mickey Hardy, he raises his hands up. And what's he doing? He just kind of pauses there. And then he just comes down hard on this bongo. Boom! we all feel it in our backs. 10,000 of us feel Mickey Hart slam us in our backs while he hits a bongo simultaneously. And it was just one of the most special things that I'd ever had happen. Then he proceeds to do things like he's on a xylophone type thing there. He's going left to right, and it's like he's scratching your back. And it's literally the only time in human history that touch is scaled. He touched 10,000 of us at once. And it's just, it was just a neat moment. So I don't go over time, so I want to thank you. Most of the research I talked about is online. Feel free to download it. If you can't find a paper, it's my last name at Gmail, Bailenson at Gmail. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much for the excellent talk and for sharing so many amazing projects with us. I have questions about the data set, especially the numberable data set from your students. As researchers, we all love data, but can you comment on, for example, the potential algorithmic bias in machine learning, for example, finding some kind of association between certain gesture movements, maybe due to like physical condition or even cultural background, and certain educational outcome? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So Mark Miller in particular studies the dark side of the tracking data, right? So when you've got tracking data, we consider this biometric data, right? We know how you've moved your body, we know where you look at things, and so if you use a machine learning algorithm, with those 700 people in my class, it takes 5 minutes of data, 5 minutes of data for a machine learning algorithm to train itself, and you randomly pick someone out of the pile. With 5 minutes of data, you reach 98% accuracy. Okay, 5 minutes of data. Now, once you extend that out, it gets even higher. So body movements are identifying, and so we think a lot about that, and we think a lot about algorithms on how to counter that. So we do think a lot about it. On the bias side about accessibility, there's great conferences, Accessibility XR, people that study that, and it's something that we work on all the time, but we need to do better. Yeah, thank you.
Hi. So many projects, so many domains. Is this all just coming out of VHIL? And on a practical level, like, how do you do it? How do you keep track of all that?
Yeah, thank you. Brilliant graduate students. So when I arrived at Stanford, I became a SAIL, right? Brilliant student minds do all the work, and I just kind of like let them move me. But no, everything I talked about today led authored by students, and I get the privilege of working with people a lot smarter than me. I didn't get into Stanford when I applied, and we work really hard. They work really hard, and I try to be responsive to them. So we just, we're a small team. There's 5 of us right now, 6 of us, but we try to be efficient. But thank you.
It's incredible. Thanks.
Yeah. But yes, it's all graduate student-led research. Well, thank you very much, everybody.